Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back on this breezy day. I hope you and your families are doing okay. Just real quickly, if you can hear me okay, please type yes into the chat window. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, gang, welcome back. Let me mention to you, because this just came out, the administration has now released the final exam schedule for classes. So I want to make you aware that your final exam in this course is Wednesday, May 13th. Once again, your final exam will be Wednesday, May 13th. And I will write that out in my afternoon email to you, so that'll be documented. Okay, so Wednesday, May 13th, we will be finishing the class. That will be your final exam day. Before we get started, do you have any questions at this time? Okay, not seeing anything or hearing anything. What I will do is go to the Word document, and folks, we got to cover as much as we can of chapter 14 today. Normally, I would like to have a little bit more time on this, but things are getting compressed here. So today is it for chapter 14, and you know that you have your third lecture exam of the semester on Monday, right? Your third lecture exam is Monday. And if you did receive the study guide in the previous email from Monday, please type yes into the chat window. Okay, all right, good. Okay, all right, wonderful. So let me know if you have any questions, but we should be set up pretty well for exam 3 this coming Monday. Once again, because you're taking an exam on Monday, there will be no lecture on Monday, so you don't have to Zoom in on Monday at 12:30. But you do need to take your online exam, both the vocab portion and the essay portion, by the end of the day on Monday at the Class Marker website. Okay, folks, let's continue and see what we can do for chapter 14. Okay, so let's see here. I need to get the chat window up for you here. Okay, chat window's up. If you need to get a hold of me, go ahead. And so we are talking about chapter 14, the respiratory system. Okay. All right, so normally I would spend more time trying to draw information out of you, but there's things I just need to get into you, okay? So I'll start with this question and then I'll sort of answer it for myself, okay? So the question becomes, what is the primary function of the respiratory system? And I'm sure that many of you could answer that, but let me just move us along here. The primary function of your respiratory system is to provide a way to exchange gases between your body tissues and the outside world. In other words, a way to get oxygen into your body and a way to get carbon dioxide out of the body. The primary function of the respiratory system and the anatomy that does the work of the respiratory system is to provide gas exchange between the atmosphere and the tissues of your body, okay, to allow oxygen to enter your tissues and to allow CO2 to be removed from the tissues. Okay, that is the primary function of the respiratory system. there's a subtlety here. A lot of folks get confused sometimes, right? We have the cardiovascular system, which we've talked about recently. The cardiovascular system has the job of moving blood throughout the body. And of course, the blood, if it came freshly from the lungs, is carrying oxygen. But the job of the cardiovascular system is simply to move the cargo, to move the blood, to move the oxygen that's in the blood supply. But it's not involved with exchanging the oxygen between the bloodstream and the tissues and organs of the body. That is exclusively the domain of the respiratory system. Okay, any questions right now? Okay, here's another question. I think we kind of all intuitively know and understand why it's important that we breathe in oxygen in every breath, right? Oxygen is deeply important for your body. If you don't get enough oxygen, you're going to pass out. And you know, kind of from things you learned in chapter 3 with aerobic cellular respiration, that we need oxygen to optimize our energy production, to optimize how efficiently we manufacture ATP. So we kind of know that. But there's another side to the coin here, and that has to do with carbon dioxide. So my question is this: why is it important that carbon dioxide, okay, CO2, be removed from the body? If you think you know the answer to that, please speak up, unmute your microphone, or type it into the chat window. Why is it important to remove carbon dioxide from the body? What do you think, folks?
Well, I think basically to remove the CO2 from the body, since it's a byproduct from our body, that if you have an over amount of it, it can cause, I mean, I would think, parts of the body to fail, or specifically the respiratory system.
Okay, is this Juan that's talking?
Oh, no, Carlos.
I'm sorry, Carlos. Okay. Carlos, thank you very much. You are onto something there. You are onto something, and some of you in the chat window mentioned that it's toxic. That's a good idea. So what is it about CO2 that makes CO2 toxic? If CO2 stays in the body, why is it dangerous? What's it going to do to us?
Won't it take up space in our red blood cells? And so if it takes up space in our red blood cells, oxygen won't have any space to carry out its tasks.
Okay, so Silver?
Yes.
That's a nice idea, but you've made a mistake that folks often do make, and that is CO2 does not take the place of oxygen. You're thinking about carbon monoxide, carbon with a single oxygen atom. That's not what will happen with CO2. All right, so thank you for trying, but that's not it. Anybody else? Okay, let me give you this hint. Why do all the scientists of the world get worried when we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere due to global warming? What will it do to our oceans?
Won't it make it acidic?
Yes, there you go. That's what I'm after. Okay, gang. When excess CO2 is allowed to remain in the body, particularly the bloodstream, it meaning CO2, will acidify the environment. Okay? I'm going to put a little bit of a chemistry statement in your notes. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to beat you up on the test with it, but I still need to tell you this. Okay, when you have CO2 in the body and you combine it with the H2O, the water of your blood plasma, what will happen is that will promote a chemical reaction that forms a substance called H2CO3, which is a chemical symbol for carbonic acid. Okay, so if you leave the CO2 in the body, it will mix with whatever water is around. And of course, you know your body is a big sack of water. All of us are basically a big sack of water. That's going to create an acid. We will acidify the environment, and then any cells and any molecules in the cells in that acidified environment, because it has a lower pH, are going to change their shape and not function properly. So that's how excess carbon dioxide is actually toxic to us. Okay, folks, any questions? All right. Now, when we think about the term respiration, okay, its meaning is very contextual. Okay, we can talk about aerobic cellular respiration, right? That phrase there has the word respiration in it. In this context, respiration is what we're talking about, about the chemistry that cells perform to make energy from the food, right? In this context, respiration is referring to the cellular chemistry of making energy from food. Okay, and obviously it's aerobic, so it's most efficient in the presence of oxygen. Okay, while that has some relevance to what we're talking about in this chapter, that's really not the main way that we're going to be talking about respiration in this chapter. In this chapter, what I'm primarily going to be talking about is organismal respiration. Organismal respiration is the focus of chapter 14, whereas cellular respiration was hinted at in chapter 3, I believe, of your textbook. Okay, so we're going to be talking about organismal respiration for our time together today. Now, when we talk about organismal respiration, there's basically 4 components of it, okay? And they are the following. First, we have breathing. Now, breathing is also a loaded word because, I mean, we all know what we mean by breathing, right? You're sitting in the room and everybody's inhaling and exhaling, okay? In the technical sense, there's a lot of things that happen in between exhale and in between inhale and exhale, and we need to talk about that. But when I talk about breathing here, I'm talking about a process known as ventilation. Okay, ventilation is technically what we're talking about here. And ventilation refers to the mechanical process of bringing air into the lungs and pushing air out of the lungs. Okay, and you know from your study guide that I've already sent you, I am going to ask you to explain ventilation on your exam Monday. So I'm going to give you some help with that today in just a little bit. Okay, so think about how your chest moves up and down as you ventilate, as you inhale and exhale. That's something we're going to be talking about. A second aspect of breathing is what's called external respiration. Okay, and excuse me, a second aspect of organismal respiration is called external respiration. External respiration is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the air that you put into your lungs and the bloodstream. Okay, external respiration is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the air of the lungs and the bloodstream, okay? This is all about how do you take that oxygen that you just physically brought into the lungs and how do you get it into your tissues? Well, to do that, that oxygen has to cross a structure in the lungs called the respiratory membrane. And if I have time, I will point out where that takes place later today. A third aspect of organismal respiration is gas transport, okay? And in this case, we are talking about the actual motion of the gases as they are dissolved in the bloodstream to the body tissues. And of course, that is facilitated by the motion of the blood, which is in the domain of the cardiovascular system, okay? This refers to the transport, or I guess I should say movement of dissolved gases in the bloodstream as the heart pushes blood throughout the body. And then the final aspect of organismal respiration before the whole process kind of repeats itself is internal respiration. Internal respiration is the exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the blood with the surrounding tissue that the blood is serving. You know, whatever capillary bed the blood vessels are in, you know, are we delivering oxygen to the kidney? Are we delivering oxygen to the thyroid gland? Are we delivering oxygen to the brain? At the same time, are we removing carbon dioxide from the brain? Are we removing carbon dioxide from the liver or the kidney or the uterus or whatever it might be that we're talking about? So internal respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the bloodstream and the cells, tissues of the body. Okay, gang. So those are the four aspects of organismal respiration, and that's really the focus of chapter 14, more so than aerobic cellular respiration. At this time, do you have any questions? Okay. All right. So usually if I had the luxury of a little bit more time with you, I would go over a considerable amount of the respiratory anatomy on page 270 with you. But I know that there's certain goals I need to finish today so that you're ready for your exam. So I'm going to take a very superficial coverage of the respiratory system anatomy at this time and simply give you a statement about how air enters your body and gets into your lungs so then it can get into the bloodstream. The gases can get into the bloodstream, okay? Airflow into the body. Respiratory system anatomy. And what I'm going to do is just give us a little flow chart that highlights the basic anatomical pathway that air moves as it enters and goes into the body. All right, and of course, you know, we can take air into our nose, we can also take air into our mouth. And of course, if you have a cold and your nose is stuffed up with all kinds of goo, then you will breathe through the mouth, and that's appropriate. But in normal everyday circumstances, when we're healthy and our noses are not blocked up through allergies or other problems, Mother Nature did intend for us to inhale through our nostrils and not our mouth. So, air begins to enter the body at the nasal cavities. Okay, and so just have open page 270 in your textbook so that you can look at these things as we're talking about them, right? You can see the nasal cavities there. I mean, you know where your nostrils are, where the holes that open in your nose are. As soon as you enter that, the air is entering the nasal cavities. You may or may not be aware of that in the bones of your skull, there's a very special bone in the nasal cavity that's called the ethmoid bone. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to test you on that. I will test you on it if you take anatomy and physiology. But there's this bone called the ethmoid bone that has a very maze-like structure. And what that maze-like structure of the bone requires of the air is that the air moves back and forth through these passageways in the bones so that the air spends enough time in the nasal cavities that the temperature of the air can be adjusted or equilibrated to the inside temperature of your body. Okay, so air enters the nasal cavities. All right, we're just going to continue our journey here. Air enters the nasal cavities. It then passes into the pharynx. Okay, so just put an eyeball on the pharynx on page 270. Okay, the pharynx is simply a tube, a passageway for the motion of food and air. That's all it is. Okay. From here, the air is going to enter the larynx. All right. So you can see that the larynx is sort of the bottom part of the pharynx there. Okay. So the tubing connects to each other. And of course, it's the larynx where you have your vocal cords and things. That's where your voice box is positioned. If if the larynx is open, then the air can move down towards the lungs. And of course, if the larynx is closed by the flap of cartilage tissue we call the epiglottis, then that material will be diverted away from the lungs and it will go down the esophagus and enter your stomach. Okay, so you can think of the larynx as sort of a fork in the road. One path allows that material to go into the lungs, the other path allows material to go into the stomach. And I'm sure we've all experienced moments where, we got something down the wrong tube, so to speak, and we got a little bit of liquid from a Coca-Cola or something down into our lungs, and we were coughing because things went down the wrong tube. Okay, so air will go from the larynx at this point, and it will enter the trachea. So you can see the trachea there on the right-hand side of page 270. From the trachea, the air is going to pass into the bronchi. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard of bronchi and bronchioles. People that have asthma have problems with these pieces of anatomy in their body. The air will then go from the bronchi to the bronchioles. The air from the bronchioles will then go into special microscopic chambers that are actually called alveoli. Okay, and that's where we end our journey for this part of the conversation. Now, let's see here. I don't think your textbook has quite all the detail that I would normally want. Well, okay, that's not too bad. If you look on page 277 of your textbook, page 277, okay, you see figure 1411 there. And take a look at the alveoli, or the group of them that's called an alveolus. Can somebody tell me what kind of material, I see your question, Carlos, I'll get to you in just a moment. What kind of material is wrapped around the alveoli? Please type that into the chat window if you see it. What kind of material is wrapped around the alveoli? Anybody? You can answer the question by looking at the picture on page 274, figure 14.8, or looking at figure 14.11 and 277. What fish, let me do it this way. What fishnet is wrapped around the alveoli? Okay, Juan, fantastic, fantastic, absolutely. The capillaries. That's my point, gang. It's in the alveoli where the air that you just inhaled is intimately, physically close to the bloodstream because the alveoli are wrapped inside this fishnet of capillaries. And you know the capillaries are tiny, tiny blood vessels. Okay? So if I were to continue my journey here for number 8, I haven't forgotten about your question, Carlos. The oxygen that goes into the lungs goes into these microscopic gas exchange chambers called the alveoli. And it's at the alveoli, which is wrapped in the capillary beds of the bloodstream, that gas moves from the cells of the alveolus across the respiratory membrane and across the epithelial cells making up the capillary wall and into the bloodstream. On page 277, figure 1411, look at the rightmost picture there, which is called external respiration. There is an arrow that's illustrating the motion of oxygen from the alveolus across that intermediary barrier, which is technically the respiratory membrane, and into the bloodstream. What color is that arrow that I'm talking about? Okay, red, good. That's what I'm wanting to be sure that you're appreciating it, okay? So that red colored arrow on page 277 is showing you the direction that oxygen is going to move. It's going to move from the anatomy of the alveolus and literally cross a few cells worth of material and get into the bloodstream, okay? So oxygen crosses the cells of the alveoli and crosses the cells of the alveoli, the cells of the capillaries, and enters the bloodstream. Okay? That's how it's done. Okay, so Carlos, you asked, why is it harder to breathe in cold air versus warm air? Well, that's a loaded question. It's difficult to answer that, but certainly one aspect to it is because cold air causes your bronchial tubes to actually constrict and actually reduce their diameter. So their diameter gets smaller, the tubing gets a little bit smaller, so it's just harder to physically bring the same volume of air into the lungs because the smooth muscle tissue of the bronchioles and the surrounding lung anatomy are very delicate, and when you expose them to cold air, they reflexively sort of tighten up and they shorten, they contract a little bit, and that makes the bronchial tubing smaller, so it's harder to bring the air inside. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. All right. Gang, any other questions at this time? Okay, so I would like to highlight in your notes that the alveoli are the gas exchange chambers in your lungs. Okay, and I will also say this. The gas exchange chambers of the lungs, the alveoli, are exceedingly delicate. They are exceedingly delicate. And these chambers can be damaged by inhaling things like the smoke of a cigarette or cigar. So when smokers, when smokers smoke for a long time, for years, they are literally damaging, they are physically, anatomically damaging their alveoli. Alveoli is damaged by inhaling toxins, including cigarette smoke. Okay, what the toxins, including cigarette smoke, will do is, if you look at any picture of the alveoli, they kind of look like grapes you might buy at the supermarket, like a nice plump, full grape. Well, what happens is when you start putting those toxins into the alveoli, it changes the chemistry inside the alveoli, and all of a sudden the alveoli begin to collapse on themselves. So you go from a nice plump grape to a grape that's sort of squashed and flattened. And if that happens, you reduce the surface area available to bring oxygen into the body to cross the capillary wall into the bloodstream. Okay, smoking changes the shape of alveoli. It flattens them, making it harder to bring oxygen into the bloodstream. Okay. So, and I know it's a difficult thing for folks that do smoke. I mean, I've had family members that smoke. I have family members that smoke. It's a very personal thing that people get angry about very quick if you start saying, hey, why don't you stop smoking? But truthfully, gang, you are damaging your body if you smoke. And if you have other people in the room, including children, around you when you smoke, you are contributing to the destruction of their alveoli. Okay? So really, really think hard about whether you want to continue to smoke or not. It is a waste of your money, and it is going to create problems for you down the road. So any questions at this time? Okay. All right. Let's continue here. Okay, so now there's other things I can talk to you about, but I want to be sure we definitely cover this topic of ventilation so that you're in good shape for your exam on Monday. Okay, so let's talk about the process of ventilation. Okay, so formally speaking, I'm talking about the first part of the organismal respiration. That's what your essay is on. It's on the first aspect of organismal respiration. Okay, so a couple talking points here. Okay, when you move air into or out of the lungs, the motion of that air obeys the same basic principles as other topics we have already talked about in the course, and which hopefully you already have an intuition for. But let me ask it this way. Well, let me put some notes down here, okay? Air moves in the same direction as other processes have been described. Okay, I'm being very cagey at this moment because I'm trying to draw something out of you. Okay, for example, okay, if you are standing close to, okay, now let me rephrase that. do you feel the warmth of a fire when you are standing closer to it or further away? I mean, I know that's an easy question. Just type your answer into the chat window. You feel the warmth of fire when you're standing closer to it or further away?
Closer.
Okay, fair enough. Closer, right? So what I'm trying to get you to see is that the heat energy of the fire, the source of the fire, the wood that's burning, right? The heat energy is closest towards the source, and the heat energy is weakened or lower or diminished further away from the source. That means that heat energy goes from the high intensity area of the fire to the lower intensity of the fire as you move further away from the fire. Heat spreads out. It goes from high to low as you move away from the source of the fire. Okay, heat spreads out. It goes from high to low as you move away from the source of the fire. I think you can appreciate it's going to be the same thing. If you're at a large rock concert, do you hear the sound of the rock music most intensely when you're standing next to the loudspeakers or 100 yards away from the loudspeakers? Well, obviously, when you're standing right next to the loudspeakers. Okay? In a similar way, sound energy spreads out. It goes from high to low the further you are away from the source of the sound, right? So heat energy spreads out, sound energy spreads out. Okay. Well, let's talk about radiation. What year did 3 Mile Island nearly melt down? What year did 3 Mile Island almost melt down? If you don't know the answer to that, please type this into the chat window. What year were you born? Okay, so Juan was definitely not alive. Okay. All right. Okay, very good. Right, Silver has the correct answer. 3 Mile Island nearly melted down. I mean, it did experience a partial meltdown in 1979. And so we could go and talk about that at another time. That was also a very scary time to be alive, just like today is very scary. But at any rate, my thinking here is that radiation also spreads out the further away you get from the source of the radiation, right? That's why they were telling everybody that lived near the 3 Mile Island plant to evacuate, get away from this area. Okay, same idea here. Okay, so we have 3 examples of the phenomenon I'm trying to illustrate. And that phenomenon is that material, either radiation, which is matter, or energy in the form of sound or heat, material, mass, or energy, they tend to spread out and go from high to low. High where they're concentrated, where the source is, to lower where their source is not. Okay, so air moves in the same direction as other processes. So, in terms of air motion, please type into the chat window. Do you think, based on the analogies I'm putting into your notes right now, that air tends to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure or from low pressure to high pressure? Okay. All right, good. You got it, folks. That's what I'm trying to show you. Okay? Air also moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. Just like the phenomenon we've been saying here along the way, heat goes from high to low, sound goes from high to low, radiation goes from high to low. Air also moves naturally and in a passive way, in a thermodynamic way, from high pressure to low pressure. That's important that you appreciate that. Okay? All right, any questions? All right. Now, for air to move, there always has to be a difference between one location and another. There has to be an area where there is high pressure and an alternative location where there is lower pressure, okay? For air to move between two locations, there must be a difference in the air pressure between those two locations, okay? Now let's be pragmatic here. What two locations am I talking about right now? Well, the two locations are the air outside your body and the internal environment of your body, right? Those are the two locations that I'm talking about. I need a difference in air pressure between the outside air and the inside air in your lungs. Air will only move if there is a difference, okay? There must be a difference. I'm gonna underline that word different. There must be a difference in the air pressure between these two locations in order for air to move. Otherwise, it will not move in any meaningful way. So, okay. Now, this gets a little bit silly, but you ask yourself, is there anything that you as an individual human being can practically do to change the air pressure outside your body? Well, not so much. I mean, yes, you could climb a mountain. So that means you could put your body at a high altitude that has lower air pressure. Yes, you could do that. But that's not an everyday event, right? As we're sitting here in front of the computer, you know, is there anything you can do in the room that you're watching this video on, this lecture on? Is there anything you can practically do to change the air pressure? Well, not so much. I mean, yes, you could open a window, but even that would cause the air in the room to equilibrate, and then after that, there'd be nothing else you could do, okay? So practically speaking, there's nothing that you or I can do on a boring everyday basis to change the air pressure outside our body. So what I'm trying to tell you is our ability to breathe is dependent on our own body's ability to alter air pressure inside itself, because we can't do anything about the air pressure outside our body. So our ability to breathe depends on changing air pressure inside our body. Because we cannot practically change air pressure outside our bodies, we rely on our bodies to change air pressure internally to enable ventilation. Okay? All right. So, please ask questions if you have them. Okay, so we're going to put down a basic table here. At least I'm hoping to do it if my software doesn't crash on me or piss me off. Let me see here. Okay, so in this table, I want to make some generic statements. And the first statement is The first column is going to be the lung air pressure, so the pressure of the air in the lungs. The middle column is going to be a statement about the environment pressure, and I mean outside the body, outside air pressure, okay, environmental air pressure outside the body. And then a statement about the direction that air moves. Okay, and these are all going to be column headings here. Now we could talk about numbers. I could put numbers on this, but I'm not going to hold you responsible for that at this time. Okay. If the lung pressure is low, well, that's a relative statement, right? Low relative to what? Well, I'm saying if the lung pressure is low compared to the outside pressure, which means the outside pressure has to be high, then what that means is that air is always going to move from high air pressure to low air pressure. So type an answer into the chat window. For this first column, for this first row, are we going to inhale or exhale? Okay, Carlos says exhale. Do you agree with him? Huh. Okay, I've got two of you saying exhale. Gang, remember that air moves from high pressure to low pressure. So high pressure outside the body to low pressure inside the body. Do you see that? In fact, that's going to be inhalation. Does that make sense? Okay. And so we can reverse that, and you immediately know what the answers are going to be. Excuse me. If the air pressure in your lungs is high relative to the outside air pressure being lower, then we're going to actually exhale. Okay, exhalation. Okay. Okay. Folks, does this chart working for you? Does it make sense? Does the logic of it make sense with what we've been saying so far? I hope so. Okay, please ask questions. I want you to understand. Please ask questions if you haven't. All right, now I'll tell you this, but I promise I'm not going to really hold you responsible for it on the test. That is that, does anybody know what standard atmospheric air pressure is at sea level? Do any of you enjoy sailing or anything like that, and you spend a lot of time down at the beach or the seashore? Does anybody know what atmospheric air pressure is at sea level? Okay, so you folks are too poor to have a boat, just like I'm too poor to have a boat. Okay, very good. Okay, so Carlos, I'm not sure what you mean by higher than above sea level. But at any rate, let me say this. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is typically 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, don't worry about what that necessarily means. We'd have to go into some physics for that. But atmospheric air pressure is typically 760 millimeters of mercury. That means if I go up to my chart, the air pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay? And as we said, there's nothing that you can really do on a pragmatic basis to change that. So it's 760 millimeters of mercury, whether I'm inhaling or exhaling. Okay? Whether I'm inhaling or exhaling, it's still 760 millimeters of mercury. What happens though in your body, right, in the first column with the lung air pressure, when the anatomy of your body moves in a certain way, and I will explain that in a moment, when it moves in a certain way, the lung air pressure momentarily becomes 758 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so you can see that if I have 760 millimeters of mercury outside the body and 758 inside the body, I have a scenario where I have high to low. Now, because we can't do anything with the outside air pressure, I'm still got 760 millimeters of mercury when I exhale, but the reality of it is the body anatomy changes in a certain way so that you now have 762 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so if I have 762 here, that is high compared to the lower of 760 outside the body. Questions, gang? Okay. So let's take the next step on this topic. Okay, the next step is this. We need to understand how the anatomy of your body changes to lower that air pressure to 758 so that you can inhale. We need to understand that, okay? So let me define something for you. There are two primary muscles that facilitate ventilation. Do you know what they are? If you know what they are, type them into the chat window. What are the two primary muscles that allow for ventilation to work properly? What are the muscles that allow you to inhale and allow you to exhale? Okay, all right. I guess I need to give you some hints here, okay? The two primary muscles are the diaphragm, okay, and the intercostal muscles of your rib cage, okay? So you can see them diagrammed at various locations in the chapter, but probably the biggest picture is on page 270 of your textbook, figure 14.2. So if you're looking at that on page 270, notice where the diaphragm is. The diaphragm is underneath your lungs. And then the intercostal muscles, you can see, are sort of in between the ribs of your rib cage. Gang, those two groups of muscles work in a coordinated way to lower the air pressure in your body when you inhale. And they also work in a coordinated way to raise the air pressure in your chest so that you can exhale. And that's what I want to go over with you next. Okay? So, during inhalation, the following events happen before air is brought into the body, okay? What I've noticed over the years teaching this topic is that sometimes students put the cart before the horse, or the cart in front of the horse, I guess I should say. You kind of get it backwards in the logic. So we need to be careful about this. So during inhalation, what happens before the air can be brought into the body is that the diaphragm and intercostal muscles of the rib cage both contract, okay? So we have the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract. Now, I wish I was with you at this time. I really wish we were together in the classroom because there's some aspects of this that are just that much easier to understand that if I'm with you and I can show you in person. But at any rate, you can kind of get a feel for what's going to happen by looking at page 275, figure 14.9. Figure 14.9. When the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract, the diaphragm, okay, the diaphragm lowers. Okay, the diaphragm goes lower into your abdomen. The diaphragm lowers into the abdomen. And when that happens, that makes the volume of space above the diaphragm larger. Okay. Gang, do you know what cavity, what body cavity is above the diaphragm? If you know what body cavity is above the diaphragm, please type that into the chat window. Okay, Carlos, chest cavity I can work with. Okay, the chest cavity is correct. The more technically correct term would be the thoracic cavity, but you have the right idea. So what I'm saying is that when the diaphragm contracts, it moves down into the abdomen, which makes the volume of space above the diaphragm, which is, okay, I need to learn to spell diaphragm, which is the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity gets larger, okay? And if you make the volume of space in the thoracic cavity larger, what's going to happen to the air pressure in that space? Is it going to go up or down? If I make the volume of space in the thoracic cavity larger, what does that do to the air pressure in the thoracic cavity? Can you answer that? Okay, thank you for participating, Carlos. But unfortunately, it goes the other way. If the volume of space goes up, so you have a larger amount of space for the same number of air molecules to be in, then the air pressure actually goes down. Okay. Okay. Let's look at that statement again. Diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract. The diaphragm lowers into the abdomen. This makes the volume of space in the thoracic cavity get larger. So if you make the volume of space bigger, then the air pressure actually goes down. Okay? I don't want to go any further until you're comfortable with this. Okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? What can I do to help you with this, gang?
Dr. Allen, Professor
Yes.
Allen. This is Carlos.
Go ahead.
So just for me to understand it better, basically when you're inhaling, the diaphragm is contracting. When you're exhaling, the diaphragm is not contracting, it's getting more relaxed, causing more space for volume of air to be available.
You said a lot of correct things there, but one wrong thing. When you exhale,
Okay,
the
exhale.
diaphragm relaxes, which decreases the volume of space, leading to an increase in air pressure.
Okay, that makes more sense to me.
Okay, all right. So let's come down here and make a bullet point, okay? as the volume of a space increases, the air pressure in that space goes down. Okay? As the volume of space increases, the air pressure in that space goes down. Folks, if I go up in the volume and down in the pressure, is that a direct or inverse relationship? If I have one thing go up and the other thing go down, is that a direct or inverse relationship? Okay, let's cut right to the chase here. If volume goes up, then pressure goes down. Is that a direct or inverse relationship? Boy, we need to study some graphs. We need some more math in the course. Okay, gang, that's an inverse relationship. If you are talking about two things that are related to each other, and one thing goes in one direction and the other thing goes in the opposite direction, that is an inverse relationship. Okay. Okay. Maybe think about it this way. This is not the best analogy in the world, but think about, well, oh goodness, you folks are so young. Many years ago, some of the stupid things that young folks would do in the 50s and 60s for fun was to see how many people they could cram into a telephone booth. Right? So what I'm saying is there's not a lot of space in that telephone booth to put a lot of people in. So let's say that we had 6 people crammed into a telephone booth. Do you think they would feel more or less relaxed if somebody came along and magically expanded the walls of the telephone booth to give them more space inside? Don't you think they would be more relaxed about that because they had more room to be in, so the pressure they felt to be in that space would go down? If you provide more space to be in, then there's less pressure for the stuff that's in that space. Think about it this way. Have you ever been washing something with your garden hose at the house? And have you ever noticed, just in using it, that maybe if you actually squeeze your garden hose a little bit, that it seems to make the water coming out the end of the hose squirt out a little bit more forcefully, a little bit more aggressively? That's because when you squeeze the hose to provide less space for the same volume of water, you increase the water pressure in the garden hose so that the water squirts out more forcefully. It's the same relationship here. So I ask you again, are you okay? Okay. How about the rest of you? Silver's okay. How about the rest of you? All right. Okay. All right. For everybody that doesn't answer, I'm going to assume that you are passed out on your couch and there's nothing more that can be done for you. Okay. All right. So everything we're talking about here, okay, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contract. This is part of section A. I only talked about the diaphragm. Let's continue here. Okay, so we have the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contracting. Okay. When the intercostal muscles contract, okay, so I want you to think about your own body at this time. Think about how your chest is moving as you inhale in your next breath. As you're inhaling air, how is your chest moving? Can you describe that on the chat window? How is your chest moving? When you inhale, how does your chest move? Doesn't it move up and forward, up and out? And that's due to the intercostal muscles contracting. So when the intercostal muscles contract, this moves your rib cage up and out. This action of moving your rib cage up and out provides more volume of space in the thoracic cavity. And if I provide more volume of space in the thoracic cavity, what happens to the air pressure in that space? It gets lower. Good. The air pressure goes down. That's exactly it, gang. Those are the anatomical pieces of the puzzle that shift their position in order to lower air pressure in the thoracic cavity so that you, in fact, can bring the air into the lungs. These things have to happen before the air is brought into the lungs. Okay. Now, there are some other aspects to this that I'll highlight for you. You notice from any, you notice from picture on page 275 and the picture on 270 that the diaphragm is underneath the lungs. And what you may not fully appreciate is that the lungs are actually connected to the very bottom lobe of the lungs are actually connected to the diaphragm by a layer of connective tissue. Okay. The top surface of the diaphragm is stitched to the bottom lobes of the lungs by connective tissue. So gang, if the diaphragm goes down, what's it going to do to the bottom lobe of the lung? If the diaphragm goes down, what will happen to the bottom lobe of the lung? I'm putting a question into the chat window. In what direction will the lobe of the lung move if the diaphragm goes down? If the diaphragm goes down and it is stitched to the bottom lobe of the lung, okay, Abigail, the bottom lobe of the lung is going to go down. Can you imagine what I'm talking about, a bagpipe? Where you expand the bagpipe by opening it up, where you have an accordion between your hands. Okay, imagine you had an accordion between your hands and you had your left hand on top and your right hand on the bottom, and you moved your right hand down. Would it not in fact open up the accordion? What I'm saying is when the diaphragm goes down, it causes the bottom lobe of the lung to be pulled down, which actually opens up the volume of space in the lung, kind of like you're opening up an accordion. And if you do that, if you lower the lobe of the lung to open the space in the lung, what happens to the air pressure in the lung? It goes down, right? You give it more space, so the air pressure in the lung goes down, okay? So all of these things are at play when you inhale. Okay? Questions at this time? Questions at this time? Okay. So gang, because I need to give you a little bit of challenge in the course, I'm not going to put into your note how exhalation works, but I'll say this. Exhalation works the same way as inhalation, but in reverse. In reverse, okay? So when you exhale, you do the opposite of contracting a muscle, which is you relax the muscle. Okay? And if you relax the muscle, how do you change their positions? Well, I want you to work that out for the exam on Monday's exam. Okay? So right now, as we are sitting here with 4 minutes left, what can I help you with in terms of understanding this topic or perhaps getting ready for your exam on Monday? What can I help you with? All right, everybody's being awfully silent. So, okay. If there's no questions, then I'll just give you a few more notes about some other things that I normally talk to people about when I'm with you in the classroom. And it's just some things that will all of chapter 14 be on the exam Monday? That's a question in the chat window. Well, there will be no surprise essays. The only essay from chapter 14 is the ventilation essay, which I've given you some support on now. But there could certainly be other vocab from chapter 14 that will be on the exam. Any other questions?
As for exam purpose, relatable to the other exams that we've done in the past so far, would you say this is, I mean, it has a lot of material in it, but it's not, would you say it's less harder than the other ones? I mean.
Well, that's a little subjective. It depends on how well you've been studying and preparing for things. But I think, you know, the fact that unfortunately right now, right, this is basically an open book test because you're taking it at home. So if you've been paying attention, taking notes and thinking through some of these processes, I don't see why you can't do well. Okay, anything else? All right, then, gang, let me just put a couple notes into your notebook about some common respiratory disorders. Okay. I just want to talk about some things that often make it difficult for us to breathe. And first would be the common cold. Okay, when we get sick with the common cold, it's, you know, it makes us feel generally kind of lousy and it makes it difficult for us to breathe. The common cold, as we think of the common cold at this point, you appreciate the symptoms of a common cold are reproduced by over 200 different known viruses. And I share that with you as a reason to understand why we don't actually have a vaccine against the common cold. Because the cold is a group of symptoms that you feel bad with. You know, you might have a headache, you might have a stuffed nose, you might have a scratchy throat. All of these symptoms are part of the disease, the cold, but that cold, the symptoms can be produced by over 200 known viruses, which means if we were going to have an effective vaccine against the common cold, we would need a vaccine that protected us against over 200 different viruses. That's not technologically or economically feasible to achieve at this time with our technology. So for the foreseeable future, and honestly probably the rest of our lives, we're just going to have to suffer through with the common cold. Number two, okay, okay. Let me mention flu, or more properly, influenza. Okay, this one is different from the common cold because the viruses that cause it are different. Influenza is caused by one of three different types of viruses that mutate each year, and that's the reason that we need to get a new flu shot or vaccine every year, because these three viruses are constantly changing their genetic instructions through mutation, and the old vaccine doesn't provide protection against the current year virus. So that's why we're constantly struggling with this. And if I'm being, if we just take a moment to talk about coronavirus, there's good indications that coronavirus is probably going to be a seasonal threat to humanity. And we're probably going to need seasonal coronavirus vaccines at this point going forward, because something has changed in the mutation of the virus to make it much more infectious to human cells, and therefore makes it much more dangerous to humanity. So, moving forward, I suspect that we're going to have to start manufacturing a coronavirus every season as well. And it sucks, but that's just how it's likely to play out in the future. Okay. All right, gang. We're out of time. Do you have any questions right now before we close up shop? Okay. So I will send an email out with some information. Please keep up with that so you know what's happening in the course. And I'm going to take a small 10, 12-minute break here, and I'll be back online. If any of you need some personal attention, if you have questions you want to ask, I'll be happy to help. Otherwise, stay safe. Don't forget, take your exam. 2 exams, the vocab and essay, both on class marker on Monday, and there is no lecture on Monday. Okay? Folks, be well, and I'll see you soon.